in a post-authoritarian democracy, humor, and the Mexican media. Dr. Echeverria is professor at the Center of Studies in Political Communication at the Autonomous University of Puebla. He's also the co-chair of the Political Communication section of the International Association for Media and Communication Research. And his work is generally focused on the content of political debates, the structure of political advertising, the normative performance of news media, and the mediatization of politics in the press, among many other topics. And if you're not familiar with his work, just please go check it out. It's fascinating. Dr. Rodello is professor in the Department of Social Communication Studies at the University of Guadalajara. Her research interests include the media framing of public affairs, the gender differences in campaign messages and media coverage of election, and the freedom of expression of journalists and media workers, again, among many other topics. We also have with us today our own Professor Geoff Baym, who will provide a short commentary after the presentation by our two authors, and that we hope will lead us into a productive discussion of the work. So we're hoping to very much have some time for questions and answers and for a broader discussion afterwards. For those who don't know Dr. Baym personally, he's professor in the Department of Media Studies and Production and director of the Media and Communication doctoral program here at Klein College. His research explores the shifting styles and standards of broadcast journalism, public affairs media, and political discourse. And his work particularly examined the melding of news and entertainment and politics and popular culture. So I think we can see some parallels between the work of all of these scholars who we're lucky to have here today. So without further ado, I will turn the floor to Professors Echeverria and Rodello, and then after that to Professor Baym.
Thank you very much, Fabienne. We are really happy and honored to be here. We consider the Klein College of Media and Communication one of the primary research centers of political entertainment. And your work has been a great inspiration for what we've done in Mexico. And the 2012 volume of Geoffrey Baym expanded the findings of the Klein College to everywhere in the world, signaling that things were changing and news were meddling with entertainment, and there's some urgency to research throughout all the world. So in some way, we consider our book are considered part of a legacy of the Klein College of Media and Communication. So thank you for allowing us to present our book and listening to what we have to say. I'll share the presentation right now. Okay. So are you, I guess you are seeing my presentation, right? Okay, so this talk is called Researching Political Entertainment in a Post-Authoritarian Democracy. It's based on this book, Political Entertainment is a Post-Authoritarian Democracy, Humor, and the Mexican Media. It has been published in August 25th by Routledge. It's available everywhere, of course, and we want to convey some of the ideas and concepts on this book to you, engage in a conversation. We thought it was really important to research political entertainment in contexts that are not full democracies or advanced democracies or consolidated democracies, but in democracies that had just left the authoritarian phase and had just trying to play this democratic regime with many hindrances and many difficulties. And we thought that political entertainment plays out really differently in those post-authoritarian settings when political culture is still very authoritarian. So let me introduce this topic with some vignettes, with some examples. First, the question is, how pervasive is political entertainment in Mexico? You can see there a clown, apparently, but he was actually a news anchor. He had, for 10 years or 12 years, he had this morning TV news show, national television broadcast, and he gave news. Some important scandals came from his show, and this was not a comedy show like Comedy Central. It was not a niche show. It was national television broadcast, etc. The clown is called Broso, like the Bozo, the TV show from the 50s and 60s in the United States. And he was an opinion leader for a long time and a leading news anchor. For a second, this is the wedding of Enrique Peña Nieto, our former president, and Angélica Rivera, and people call them La Gaviota, the seagull. And she was a big soap opera star, telenovelas. You know, telenovelas are a big thing here in Mexico. And this wedding was prior to his campaign. He campaigned in 2012, but this wedding was in 2011 or 10, I guess. And it was a big show. It was like a royal wedding, 24/7 news coverage, live broadcast, and so on. And you have Enrique Peña Nieto, a good-looking guy, and this damsel, Angélica Rivera. And the coverage was like a royal wedding. All the little details, the wedding dress, etc., etc. So in this sort of campaign or pre-campaign event, you have this intermingling between politics and entertainment, this time soap opera. The last example is our current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, populist leftist president. And he gives apparently press conference every morning from 7 to 10 a.m. It's called La Mañanera. And it is a press conference. He talks to the press, engages in discussion, engages in questions, etc. But there's a part of his show when he tells jokes and mocks people and presents popular songs. Sometimes he sings. I mean, he does a lot of things. It is not a press conference. It is more like a show that engages, that allows him to engage with people. And here in this clip, in this exact moment, he's mocking the U.S. Department of Commerce, because the U.S. Department of Commerce wanted to start a trial about some dubious practices from the Mexican government in the NAFTA law. And he was mocking the U.S. government. He told, well, I'm not afraid of them. And he put this clip about his popular singers whose song is, I'm not afraid of you, and so on. He just mocks about it. So what can we conclude about these really small pieces? First, entertainment and popular culture is really intertwined in the realm of politics. And second, sometimes our politicians, Mexican politicians, in fact, instrumentalize political entertainment to their own goals, to their own political accomplishments. So we have the dimension of humor and entertainment that is really close to how politicians instrumentalize and use entertainment in a sort of manipulative way. It's really complex. We're going to describe these and other issues and dimensions of political entertainment in Mexico. But to summarize, we want to, throughout these presentations, we want to answer these questions. These are the questions that the book tries to answer to. What are the specific conditions in post-authoritarian democracies that constrain the production and outcomes of political entertainment? Of course, this is a really deep question because in authoritarian democracies, politicians do not have a sense of humor. And in political culture, citizens are not really eager to mock about their politicians. So there's a sort of self-censorship and fear of mocking politicians, laughing about them. So in a post-authoritarian democracy, some of these cultural threats remain. There are legacies. And the book talks about these legacies in terms of the production, mainly in broadcast television, but also in the internet and social media, and the outcomes in terms of the impact of this political entertainment in political culture and public opinion. So this main question develops in three specific questions. First, how political and economic conditions influence the humorous discourse in legacy media. Legacy media is a big focus of the book because, as you probably know, Mexico was an authoritarian regime for 70 years, and the media was really close to the power, to the government. It was like a propaganda machine to the Mexican government. And that left many legacies that we will explain further. Second, how political entertainment and social media is shaped by platform structures, and what is the resulting impact on creators' behavior. We see the legacy media as something that constrains entertainment production, political entertainment production. You could say that social media kind of alleviates this situation because it's kind of free, do not need a license, etc. But we think that social media, it is another form that constrains also entertainers and comedians. Finally, what are the effects of these media, satire and memes in particular, on core democratic attitudes and dispositions? And what are the consequences of this political entertainment on Mexican citizens.r in post-authoritarian political culture? Okay, Frida.
Hello. Hello, guys. Thank you, Dr. Fabian, and thank you, Dr. Geoffrey, and everyone here listening to us. Okay, now I'm going to say a few words about Mexican satire in general. As you know, television satire began in the world in the 1960s with very famous examples. And there was a very noticeable international surge of satirical content. And now we see it on every new digital platform. In Twitter, in our book, Martin is going to speak a little bit about memes and YouTube, and we have a lot of satire right now in TikTok and so on. And if we look at the past, political satire as a type of expression has taken many shapes. The genre has a very rich background in Mexico. It has been present since the dawn of television in the country. We have examples of political cartoons in the 19th century Mexican press, and it has been a form of expression in popular theater, cinema, comics, literature. We speak a little bit about it in the chapter number 2. And also in the book, we start from knowledge about the liberalization of Mexican journalism to explain the development of political entertainment in Mexico. Why? Well, there's lots of research and reflection on the structural conditions that shaped Mexican journalism. We use that knowledge to reflect on the parallel between journalism and political satire. But also in the book, we speak about several features of the political humor created during Mexico's political transition. Martin said a little bit about this, which is the weaponized use of satire against specific actors because of clientelism. And also there's self-censorship, as Martin said, and there are protecting rituals used by creators for safeguarding media corporations from allegations of bias. And also commercial considerations play a role. For example, satire is deployed in, of course, appealing formats, mostly during elections. And there are other conditions that we explain in the book, but I am going to focus on the political entertainment that emerged on the video platform YouTube. And this is the second part of the book. Why study this? There are multiple reasons. I want to mention one of them. YouTube channels represent a huge break from a situation in which mass media content was tightly controlled in the country. A symbiotic relationship between the Mexican state and mainstream television meant there was little room for caustic political satire and critique. The only commercial television consortium for decades was Televisa. In the 90s, Azteca emerged as a second option. Both of them remain highly controversial in the country due to their clientelistic approach. Their primary concern was not public responsibility, it was self-interest. And fast forward to the first decade of the new century, this equation was radically changed by the new media platforms owned by the foreign tech giants. So what we did was based in one case study and systematic observation of selected YouTube channels and interviews with content creators. And I am going to share with you some key insights on political entertainment on digital platforms. First, the question, are they free? So creators can claim to be free on the new platforms, as this can be thought of as operating outside of Mexican jurisdiction and out of the reach of Mexican elites. As I said before, this is particularly important in this context, considering the history of the media in Mexico. And nevertheless, successful satirists must still generate a profit in order to be able to devote time to these activities. Therefore, satire and political commentary based on digital platforms are shaped not just by the political and economic context that we speak about when we describe legacy media, but also by these new business models. Though apparently free, YouTube channels are still very much constrained by this pressure to conform to norms, such as the search for massive audiences that will be attractive to advertisers. And also, the YouTube case shows us that to be economically successful on digital platforms, one has to submit to a political economy governed by the specific structure of this alternative media, their affordances, and their logic. We think that this type of conditioning of political entertainment and satire can therefore be thought of as new constraints that set limits on the new media's freedom. And the conditioning that I mentioned limits the quality of public discourse by encouraging constant publication and by providing sophisticated statistics that incite creators into conforming to the most popular contents instead of encouraging contents with high professional standards. Another key insight from this part of the book is that there are tensions arising between journalism and journalism and peripheral media fields. These tensions call for strategies to enact boundaries. Specifically, political entertainers are interested in reaching the public and influencing public opinion, but they don't want to be evaluated as journalists. Mexican YouTuber Chumel Torres famously cried, "I'm not a journalist," just like Jon Stewart in the States did. It was a demand for political entertainment discourse to have a standard different from the one applied to journalism. And finally, I have to mention how political entertainment in digital media contributes to the political information flow. Political entertainment on YouTube has enormous potential for reaching the citizenry, as this type of media allows creators to craft personas with the ability to connect with large audiences via their open criticism of political and media elites and their commonsensical approach to political affairs. Mexican pioneer Broso the Clown, already mentioned by Martin, read the news on national television. Years later, we have dozens of regular people reading and commenting public affairs for hundreds of thousands of YouTube subscribers each. So independent political entertainment on YouTube can surpass the popularity of professional media and can function as an alternative source of knowledge, something that proves valuable in a context in which mass audiences grew tired of centralized and conservative mainstream media. And these last points bring forward lots of unanswered questions regarding political entertainment in digital media. I am only going to mention two. One is about the way political entertainment uses journalism as their primary source of information. Very often, satirists and amateur journalists depend on content created by professional media and professional journalists. So how will professional media be financed if their traditional audiences continue to decline, and if younger generations do not consume and do not participate in their financing? Question number two is about platform regulation. There are multiple levels at which regulation can be analyzed, but at the level of creators, most of the time, there is an absence of a professional discourse grounded in ethics and public responsibility. Yes, there are notable exceptions, but most of the time, this is what happens. And now we can go back to Martin. He's going to speak about effects.
Thank you, Frida. Lastly, I'll describe the section of the book's chapter 7 and 8 about the effects of political entertainment. And there's several conditions in the political scenario, in Mexican political culture and public opinion, that makes this setting a really interesting case study. There are hindrances for political entertainment to be useful for the public, and there are a lot of potential for political entertainment to be a really meaningful way for people to get interested and learn about politics. So the conditions are first, low news consumption. You can see here the news consumption has been in decline, as in many parts of the world. This is a study, the latest report from the Routledge Oxford Institute. And you can see the print media, it's only 24% of Mexican public consumes news through print media. It's in steep decline. Then the television, 45%. This is an important decline because it was like in 2010 to 28, like 80%, and now it's 45%. I think it's more dramatic in the US, but it's important here in Mexico. And then you have social media, 68%, and online, 87%. But the news consumption it's kind of low in those traditional formats, and it's not that low in this online environments. So that gets me to a second point. High entertainment and social media consumption. As I said, Netflix, for example, and Facebook are really big here in Mexico. And the social media consumption in times of hours per day and so on, it's really, really high. And the fact that people consumes a lot of social media means that people will eventually attend some form of political content and political entertainment content as memes or fake news and satirical news and so on, because social media is a place that is, at least in Mexico, and I guess in its own architecture, a place for entertainment mainly and to socialize and so on. At the same time, there's low trust in news media. Here, only 37% trusts in news media. It's in decline as in the rest of the world, perhaps as in the US. But we have several issues here in Mexico. People, of course, knew that news media and the government were like cronies, and people, in fact, never trusted much the news media. But now, with all the issues in the world, where people get to trust less in the news media. And finally, there's the chronic distrust against politicians. So when I say that political entertainment has a lot of potential, it's because if people, for example, has a low news consumption and does not trust in news media, then political entertainment can constitute a very important part of its media diet and news diet. Another thing is if people has chronic distrust against politicians, means that people are willing to mock on politicians, are willing to laugh at politicians, and potentially comedians are willing to laugh at politicians because they're not in high respect. So if this happens, if these four factors are at play in the equation, then what are the effects of political entertainment in their political attitudes? That's what we ask. And these conditions, these factors are very different from the US, for example. Well, some are really different, some are very alike, but we should investigate, we should research political entertainment and its effects considering these factors and not assuming that they're just like the factors or the variables that exist now in consolidated democracies. So what we did is chapter 7 presents the results from the survey we did, a couple of national surveys of television satire. We measure the effects of television satire shows on several attitudes through 2 national surveys. And then we did something like that with internet memes through 4 focus groups. This is, you can see this picture here. It is a show, it's a satire show that mocks President Andrés Manuel López Obrador during their conferences. This is an interesting fact. Satire shows are aired primarily during campaigns and not between campaigns. It seems that they try to not bother politicians, perhaps because politicians do not have a sense of humor, and these shows are aimed only during campaigns. And there are very few shows between campaigns. And you can see this meme. This is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, by the time the front runner of the race, 2018 race, and this is a laggard. So first, I'll describe the surveys, the research about the satire effects. There are 2 surveys from 2018 and 21. This was the presidential campaign. Many cases, 916 cases, and in the midterm, 1,750 cases. It's a national survey from all of our 32 states. It's slightly skewed towards, because it was an online panel, it was slightly skewed towards middle-class, highly educated people. But we think we represent, this survey represents adequately the major Mexican population. And what we found is here, it's small. I tried to describe this in detail. We asked what were the effects of the programs of satire in several attitudes and behaviors of a democratic citizenship: interest in politics, interpersonal conversation, electoral knowledge, cynicism, internal political efficacy, and institutional trust. As you can see, many of the effects are statistically significant. You have asterisks in most of them. And then you have coefficients that are really significant or important or that deserve some attention. For example, interest in politics, 0.112, compared to printed media. For printed news, for example, it's interesting. And for example, here, internal political efficacy, 0.93, which it's interesting. In 21, it's 146. And it's interesting because, for example, digital news is 128. So it's sometimes higher, the effect is higher than other traditional news formats and so on. what can we conclude about this is first, satire increases interest in politics, increases interpersonal conversation, which is the bedrock for people to gain knowledge and to share points of view and so on, to deliberate about what happens during a campaign. It mildly increases internal political efficacy. Internal political efficacy is when people feel confident that they know enough about politics to make a meaningful participation on it. It does not increase cynicism. It's corrosive. It's a negative feeling or attitude towards politics. You know, all politics are the same, and they are self-centered, egotistical individuals. Well, we found that satire does not increase cynicism, which is a big criticism of satire and humor. And finally, that does not increase institutional distrust. And we found that satiric consumption does not raises the kind of attitudes that critics and some scholars says that political humor has. And about the memes, finally, and we found after 4 focus groups interviewing 32 participants, we found some pro-democratic effects. For example, people feel that get engaged to the campaign, they get to know what's happening, what is the conversation about in the campaigns. We found that they feel that they get aware about campaigns issues, particularly for those citizens that do not consume news media. Memes are a great channel, a great venue through which they can get awareness about the issues. There's a gateway effect. This is Geoffrey proposes knows a lot about it, but there's a gateway effect where they check on a meme, they do not grasp what it is about. They Googled the subject and the news, and they learn what is this about. So that means that memes, there's a gateway between memes and news media. And they feel that memes gives them critical insights about candidate issues and the polity. For example, I have this meme, half of the face is from Andrés Manuel López Obrador, a populist candidate, and half of the face it was about Donald Trump. So people, this is the kind of memes that makes people reflect and think through some several issues. In this case, they thought about if López Obrador is just the Mexican version of Donald Trump, populist, authoritarian, strongman, etc. And that was very useful for people to reflect on the current situation of politics in the campaign. But there were another anti-democratic effects. For example, they said it's just a joke. It's not useful. I mean, it's not useful nor instructive. Does not lead me to news media. It's just a joke. And I'm saturated of memes, so I have had enough. I just get a laugh, and that's all. There's a sense of being misinformed or manipulated because they think that memes are just a form of propaganda. And they feel that through jokes, some obscure dark forces there try to manipulate public opinion through laughing. And finally, there's a disgust about negative memes. There's low internal efficacy. I mean, this is very similar to the effect of negative advertising. There's so much mud there. There's so much negative judgment, criticism, and so on, that people feel, well, if everyone is a crook, is a liar, so what's the point of going to vote? I don't get it. So that leads me to the conclusion. We have 4 main arguments or 4 main theses of the book. I'm going to describe them in detail. First, in a post-authoritarian country like Mexico, the legacies of political regime and a media culture that explicitly rejected satirical or humorous manifestations for many decades constrained political entertainment production, content, and effects. In this thesis, we are centering on the legacies of the political regime, on the very manipulative authoritarian regime that we had, and the fact that those politicians didn't have a sense of humor and perhaps don't have a sense of humor right now. Second, the freedoms afforded by digital media do not completely absolve creators from these legacies, since they must nevertheless adapt to the particular limits of the new medium. This is counterintuitive to the stances that say that the digital media and YouTube are this paradise when everyone can say anything they like, they can mock everyone, and so on. And we observe that the platforms or the algorithms of the platform in fact are constraining the creators too. And it is not this great paradise of freedom of expression. It has another hindrances and another limitations. And third, as consequences, satirical content and memes have mild effects on audiences. That is, significant yet low effects and ambiguous meanings, though the potential for civic attitudes and users remain. And we think our vision for political entertainment is optimistic. It's perhaps as Geoffrey's, it's perhaps sometimes as a silver lining, but we see that news consumption is in decline, news credibility is in decline, news trust is in decline. So we think satirical content and humor can really engage people, and people can learn from politics. But in a post-authoritarian democracy, well, there's people is very skeptical, very cynic, and they do not like or they distrust politicians, and they may think that political humor, satire is just being weaponized by politicians to manipulate, and so they don't really engage in humor and satire. Finally, and I'm going to close with this, political entertainment is a subversive and pleasurable way to be aware, understand, and critique politics, but its potential is hindered by these structural conditions. We think that the book can be used to research another post-authoritarian democracies, perhaps many post-authoritarian democracies in Latin America. For example, Argentina, which has a great tradition of satiric and humoristic television content, or Colombia with the telenovelas, or Brazil, etc. The framework can be used to research those other scenarios, but we think we can be used to research, for example, some African, Asian, or Eastern European nations where the combinations of factors are kind of alike, are kind of the same, and perhaps the phenomenon behaves more or less in the same way. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for listening to us. We are really eager to hear about your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin and Frida. Really, I mean, I think we can see a lot of parallels with some of the things that are happening in the US and also in other parts of the world. But before we move on to discuss this as a group, I want to turn the floor to Geoffrey Baym for his commentary.
Thank you, Fab, and thank you, Martin and Frida, for joining us and sharing this such interesting work. I'm honored that you say the work that I was doing a decade ago is the foundation, and I will say that the vision we had at the time was hopefully leading to, I've got the book right here, leading to this kind of work, because I think this is, exactly what we had envisioned. It's such an interesting question because political satire, as we think about it, is sort of a British invention. And then it was perfected in the context of US cable television maybe 15 years ago. But while I and my colleague at that point, Geoffrey Jones, who's now the director of the US Peabody Awards, as we were working, thinking about the ramifications of political satire as a different form of public affairs media and civic engagement, at conferences like ICA, International Communication Association, colleagues from around the world were coming up to us and saying, you know what, we have this in our country too. and the sort of a light bulb moment where we realized, I don't believe in universality for the most part. I think cultures are different, but this does seem, satire seems to be a universal thing. And we were really astounded to discover Brozo the Clown, and across Latin America, across Eastern Europe, and even across Africa, this move towards developing political satire and political humor, political entertainment, raising really important questions about international flows of media, of popular culture and media formats as well, whether exact formats are being reproduced in very different countries and cultures. And we're learning as well that, you know, that there's this process of appropriation, or what Marwan Crady once called glocalism. I'm sure you know the work of Paul Alonso, who actually has a book he's working on right now about digital satire across Latin America, and the idea of how this sort of universal global form is reworked within local cultures. And that's such an important question, which you do marvelously in this book. It's so multifaceted and also mixed methods. So I encourage everybody to give it a read, even if you're not that interested in political entertainment. I think it's just a brilliant work of how to approach such a broad context. And I really appreciate the attention you pay to the structural conditions, to the political economic conditions, because as we track the flow of satire around the world, it plays so differently in different cultures, depending on local political cultures, depending on political economic legacies. And I do have some questions that I would like to ask you here, but we'll get to that in just a second. And that's always in relationship to journalistic culture as well. So part of what you do in this book that I think is so smart is how has political entertainment taken shape relative to the work that journalists in Mexico have been engaged in, and how that itself has changed or is changing over time. And then all of this then gets so infinitely more complicated when we introduce YouTube, TikTok, and social media into the equation, because now that dynamic is really turned on its head or complexified infinitely. So I have a few questions, and I think you touched on all of this in the talk, but I'd like to bring some of this out as well. Martin, I actually taught a class on media institutions last semester, and we used your piece on Latin American modernities. And so I know that a lot of what you're doing in this work, its deep foundation is with Hallin and Mancini's notion of media systems. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more, particularly about the key ideas of instrumentalism, clientelism, and commercialization, because Hallin and Mancini are thinking about how within different national or regional contexts, these political economic forces structure media output and citizen engagement. And so obviously the way those work locally in Mexico is so critical to your work. So could you tell us a little bit more about instrumentalism, clientelism, commercialization, and how you see those changing over, let's say, the last 20 years?
Sure. Thank you very much, Geoffrey. Yes, the thing about clientelism and instrumentalization has to do that Mexican politicians and most of the Latin American politicians will try to make every piece of media content into a form of manipulation or something that is favorable to their own image, and they would try to prevent negative content to arise. And they try to sort of censor. It's not a straight censor, but it will try to structurally censor the media for not produce content that's it is unfavorable to this to their public personas. And what you had during a lot of time in Mexico, it's clientelistic arrangements between mostly broadcast and newspapers, arrangements from those entities and the government for not producing or self-censor entertainment and satirical content. And there was a case that we talk about in the book about some in the 70s, that some comedian tried to make a joke about the president, and he get a phone call from the president and told him, hey, what are you doing? Maybe you shouldn't stop, and so on. And the day after, that show got canceled, I guess. And we had a lot of time. Those were the arrangements and so on. But the thing is that after the transition to democracy in 2000, those arrangements as legacies were still there. And presidents and governors and so on did not like them to be mocked at. And they tried to censor sort of through contracts and through political advertising contracts and so on. They tried to censor this kind of humoristic expressions. So you don't have here in Mexico like the normal restraint of some comedians that say, for example, should I mock that Joe Biden because people might like him, and I could be very mean if I mock on them. But we have this structural arrangements between the government, the power, and the media here. And then as the other side of the equation, you have commercialization, because in some places, in some periods, political humor sells. Because they cater to those audiences that are not into news media and so on. That's why we have shows during campaigns, because it somehow sells and they want to sell, but they do satire very carefully. It's not open, it's not, they have to preserve their good relations with the government. They don't want to go and transgress and break the norms. They have to be mild and they have to behave if they want to preserve the contracts and the clientelistic arrangements. So yeah, it's very tense in terms of the media system that we have. Frida, you want to answer the question too?
It is, yeah, it is interesting how this has played out in the country. We developed the topic in chapters 2 and 3. It is something difficult to see directly, but we speak on those chapters about specific cases that reveal this instrumental use of political satire. And I would like to add that it is a phenomenon that was very spoke about during the transition after the party alternation that happened in Mexico during the year 2000. Before that, as you may know, there was a single party rule in Mexico. The control before the transition was more crude, more direct. There was for the most part of the century an office that had a censorship role. But after the transition, it became maybe more difficult to see, but nevertheless, we can analyze it through these cases, and there are analyses about how clientelism and the instrumental use of media by the political actors continued during and after the transition. That's it.
So I'd like to zoom out from there. It's just so interesting, because political economy is, of course, a very structuralist, sort of top-down, deterministic theory that says, power constrains. But theories of humor and satire have long thought that satire is often a voice of the people from the bottom up, All right, so the political economic structures are in tension with, Bakhtin's notion of Carnival, that was the moment when the peasants could, for a night, pretend to overthrow the rulers through parody and through mockery. So how does all of this relate to traditions, vernacular traditions of comedy or humor in Mexican culture? So that you said politicians have no sense of humor. What about the people, right? So has this always been like, are people sitting around in the bars or the tables or the public squares laughing and making these jokes, and have they always, or is this a humorless place? Tell us more.
Well, Mexicans we are very lively. We tell jokes every time. We mock about politicians. Now it's very polarized. You cannot mock about Andrés Manuel López Obrador, as perhaps you could not you cannot laugh about that Donald Trump a few years ago because someone says, hey, he's my president. But yes, there is humor in the popular culture and jokes and everything, but it does not translate into media production that is satiric or humoristic and laughs about politicians. It just doesn't happen. Humor, that sort of reflection, or that sort of, I think you're thinking about the cultural studies, for example, that they say that popular culture have place in media output, of course, because they want to communicate with people. But in Mexico, you do have this humor reflected in the media, but mostly on fiction or telenovelas. And it's very metaphorical, very allegorical. For example, telenovelas talk about violence and cartels and so on, but they do not talk about the president or the specific officials and so on. They just mention it. They process the dramas, they process the conflicts, the social popular conflicts, but they do not point out to certain political figures. And that's kind of the thing with instrumentalization and clientelism. And they kind of stop from popular culture to enter that media domain.
So then that leads us, and I think, Frida, this is the contribution you're making, at least to the talk today, to the question of YouTube and social media, which exists in different political economic structures, maybe closer to the voice of the people and further away from the voice of the corporations or the government or that clientelistic structures. But then you make this really interesting point that YouTube might not be as free as we want to believe it is, or as sort of digital optimists long thought it was. Can you talk a little bit more then about what are those constraints, whether that's historical legacies or Google's economic model for how to make money on YouTube? How do you understand those constraints and their outcomes?
Okay.
Yes, when you ask us about vernacular traditions versus political satire in Mexico, I would say it is totally reflected in the legacy versus digital comparison, legacy versus digital media comparison. Legacy media, mainly television, was very restrained and used as an instrument because it was controlled. Enter digital media, and we have less control of that kind, but we have new constraints, as you are asking me right now. And I always think about the multiple ways in which the way digital media, digital platforms are designed are not conducive for the best public discourse, but for the profit of these tech giants. And we can do research that looks into all these phenomena. I mean, all the feedback that creators get, and all these indicators and these metrics that they get, and that they understand as their objectives. And that that makes you to forget about other things that would be, as I said, conducive for a better public discourse.
That's very interesting. So just one more question, and then I'd love to open it up to all the folks who are here, which is in terms of the outcomes or effects of the growth of political entertainment in the Mexican context. You demonstrate mixed effects on civic attitudes. And I'm wondering, just sort of more broadly, how do you see the effects of all of this on political culture itself, which is, if I can put this quickly, is Mexico more democratic for having all of this political entertainment work in all these different ways, or is it less democratic, or is it a net neutral? It's just the same, status quo holds, only looks different. How do you envision the sort of broader outcomes of this change in discourse?
Yeah, that's a hard question, because the thing with political culture is that it's a long-term phenomenon, you know, and we do not have longitudinal measurements here. What we will learn and what we try to demonstrate is that, at least in this brief 2018 and 21 moments, there were gains in certain political values and democratic attitudes as an effect of watching satiric content. And there were gains checking on or political memes. If that effect remains throughout the years, I'm not sure. You have another issue, and that kind of answered the question that you previously posed about the social media. The thing is that the government has put digital troops and digital disinformation operation that uses media, humor, and satire and memes to engage people into their propaganda operations. So, because it's not only clientelism, instrumentalization of legacy media, it's instrumentalization of social media platforms too. So there's an issue there, because whether you have high effects or significant effects, then you have another counter-democratic, so to speak, effects. And it's really hard to see what will come. But in our book, in those little moments, we have reasons to be hopeful and to be optimistic about the potential of humor in the Mexican setting.
Great, thank you. I think that's my list. Really, just such interesting stuff. Fab, I'll hand it back to you, and you can moderate from here.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for all those really good questions that really did a very nice start to the conversation here. Do we have questions from the audience? All right, there's one in the chat from Miles. How does social media impact the distribution of political information?
Okay, can I answer that, Frida?
How the social media? I would say in line with the previous question and what Martin was saying, that we can speak about the entrance, I mean, very clearly, the entrance of new discourses to the political information flow in the country. And I see that as positive, although it has also there are some dangers in that. And Martin already spoke about some instances in which social media has been used as well to try to influence the electoral contests in 2021. with influencers acting in a coordinated way. But in general, I think that what happens is that it is opening, social media is opening, it is letting new discourses enter the political information flow, and that's positive.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat, and by the way, if you can post your questions in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand, and we'll allow you to unmute yourself. Either way is fine. But a question from Chase in the chat asking, you mentioned that systems in Brazil, parts of Europe, etc., help create an environment that benefit political and entertainment that could be beneficial to study. What about those systems helps them proliferate political entertainment?
So I understand that in Brazil and Eastern Europe, there are factors and conditions that helps proliferate political entertainment. Okay, I'm gonna answer to what I understand. Okay. From a demand side, because it's a relationship between demand and supply. From the demand side, I think there's potential in those systems, as in Mexico. I do in the parallel with Mexico, for political entertainment consumption, because those factors that I mentioned, for example, low news consumption, are there too in Brazil and some parts of Europe, I say. And when you have low news consumption and then you have production of some certain level of political entertainment, people perhaps get aware of the political developments, get aware of the political world through entertainment, not through the news. This is not to say that political entertainment competes to the news. It's not a competition with those two domains. It's a very different things, very different domains. But there's a place for political entertainment, infotainment, for example, to engage and perhaps sometimes mobilize people. And when news demand is kind of low, and there's potential for political entertainment to create significant effects for the people that does not consume news. And I think there are many chances for political entertainment to thrive in those places and that present those factors.
Can I jump in
Sure.
very briefly here as well, Chase? It's a great question, and I think partially this always has to do with the question of what work does traditional news do, right? So in a very politically free culture, journalism traditionally has been very free to criticize political leaders, to raise important discussion questions, to try to engage the public in a civic process, whereas in states and countries that are less democratic or entirely undemocratic, as we heard already with this notion of clientelism and instrumentalism, that the press might not play that role. And then that creates, there's always sort of, I think, this democratic impulse where people want to be able to speak freely and criticize and critique. And so entertainment is a very powerful way to do that. As Martine noted, it sells well. So economically, there is incentive for broadcasters and other media companies to try to get in on that action. And also, it's comedy has always been a way to criticize political leaders, even dictatorial political leaders, in ways that are very hard to police, right? It's a bad look, if you will, to put the comedian in jail, which is why satire has always been a very vibrant form of opposition. The question then becomes, how institutionalized does it become? Like in this country, where Jon Stewart and then Trevor Noah and John Oliver, those folks have been doing this now day in and day out for decades. The study here in Mexico looking at how it's becoming part of the media landscape in really interesting ways. That's my little bit. I'll stop.
Well, I have a question if no one else wants to jump in at the moment. I also come from a culture of France that has a very strong history of political satire, but a lot of times, it's only in the French context, there's a lot of controversy surrounding the satire. For example, Charlie Hebdo comes to mind with as a very highly controversial newspaper, and they do call themselves journalists in the French context. Do you have, are there any controversies surrounding, for example, issues of culture or religion or gender? I mean, even in the US, there's complaints that a lot of the satire is very kind of male dominated. Do you see that in the Mexican context, or is that not something that that you've looked at or that you're seeing?
I think that part of the consequences of being a transitional democracy is that Mexican political humor is not very edgy. It does not criticize, I don't know, the church, nor the army, the military, nor it's very conservative. This is a contradiction, of course. It's a political humor that is very conservative. So, and that's because the political system sanctions if there's a transgression. And directly, it's not the audiences that sanctions, but perhaps they do, but immediately, in the short term, it is the system, the political system, that, for example, there was a critique from one comedian towards the wife of the president. He had a show in HBO, and there was this huge controversy on Twitter about what he said about her wife, president's wife. And the day after, or 2 days after, the show was canceled. So the rest of the comedians, they say, well, we should behave, we should not touch upon some issues and some personas because we can be censored too. So yeah, no. And I wanted to add one thing about what Geoffrey said, and this is in line with the previous question. The thing about the enormous supply and enormous demand of political entertainment is happening right now in TikTok. And this can give us a clue about what will happen in the future, in the midterm, for example. But those kids that are in TikTok right now, they are politically socialized in those, because a lot of kids, what they know about politics is what they see in TikTok, in campaigns and in news and so on. And the popular discourse is really intertwined with the TikTok output. So I think it's a great laboratory to see what will happen in the future in the US, in Mexico, etc., in the near future.
Thank you. We have another question from Chase in the chat. Let's go with that. You mentioned that your research shows that political satire within this time might not be causing a decrease in trust or cynicism, despite that being often criticism of political satire. Why do you think that is?
That's a great question. That's a great question because I do not have a clear-cut answer. Perhaps it's because we are so cynic. I mean, Mexican political culture is so cynic that every other content does not make us more cynic than we are. It's the effect, it's mild, it's negligible, because that single trait, that single attitude, it's really high. That happens with distrust, for example. It's not that the media output makes you distrustful, it's because you are distrustful, and the output, the effects are not that high. That's my explanation. Of course, that deserves a paper in itself because it's a really interesting question.
Thank you. We have time maybe for one more question. Patrick?
Patrick.
Martin and Frida, first of all, I just want to thank you for joining Klein College. I'm joining from Rome here, and it's my pleasure to be sort of just part of the audience and learning about your research. My question's, I guess, a pretty basic one, which is you talked a little bit about legacy media in terms of television, but I wonder to what extent does some of this political satire originate from or echo within radio? You know, the truck drivers, the bars, the cantinas, the places where people maybe get a charge out of it and can or cannot maybe politicize some action. I just wondered if you sort of had a beat on that and wanted to ask that.
Okay, Frida?
There's a potential for research on that because radio is harder to study because we don't have records, but I know there have been shows of political satire in radio. I don't have recordings for studying those works, but we can presume that there must be instances because what you would not expect maybe is, for example, that Mexico had a very, very rich tradition in comics. Comics were a thing in Mexico during the 20th century, and we have very interesting instances of political commentary and political contents there, and they got into all kinds of people. All kinds of people could read comics, so that's interesting. I don't know about radio.
Yeah, that's interesting that you would mention the comics and which goes back, I think, to what Jeff was talking about earlier, the flows of influence between different contexts, right? Where you have, so of course, like in France, also a very long tradition of political humor through comics. I mean, Charlie Hebdo being print, cartoons and type of humor, right? And so we see that, again, transnational influence going both ways, of course, not just, from Europe to Mexico, but also the other way around, which I think is interesting. All right, well, I think we're pretty much out of time, so we're going to have to stop here. But thank you so very much for being with us today. Such an enjoyable moment that we were able to spend together, and I very much appreciate your willingness to join us. And thank you to Jeff as well for his contribution today to the conversation. And thanks to everyone who joined. Thank you very much.
Thank
And
you very much.
see you
Thank you very much, Fabian.
speaker series.